Thank you, Katie. Thank you, everyone. Hope you're all doing well tonight. Just wanted to say thanks very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and an honour to come in and speak to so many gardeners. I feel a little bit intimidated right now because I'm not a very good gardener. So to come and speak to so many green-fingered individuals is a little bit intimidating for me. As long as we don't talk about aces and azaleas and things, I think we'll be okay. So thank you for having me. I was thinking about my experience of the garden before coming to speak to you tonight, and like many people in 2020, I had a little go at gardening when we had the lockdown and we were at home, didn't have much else to do, so I thought I'd try my hand in the garden, and I thought, do you know what, we'll do something practical. We'll try and grow some vegetables. And I thought tomatoes would be an easy thing to try. So bought the tomato plants, got them in the big planters we've got, and made my little stand with a string hanging down to hold them up, and everything was going really well. And I thought, do you know what, I think I can outsmart the rest of everyone else and make them grow faster. And I thought, I've got this Tomarite, and if I feed them every day with the Tomarite, they're going to grow. And they did grow, but the problem was they got to about 12 foot tall and I got no tomatoes. So I had these enormous things on steroids in these planters and no. I know, that's young arrogance coming through there. So the moral of the story is don't think you're cleverer than you are. But in all seriousness, I help a lot of gardeners at my practice in Farnham. So I've got a physio clinic called HT Physio that I set up in 2018. My grandparents are very keen gardeners, so I've spent some time helping them, not just in the garden, but with their gardening-related injuries. And we probably have 20 or 30 active patients with gardening injuries in the clinic that are helped by me or one of my other physios. So I'll just introduce myself quickly and then we'll talk about the topic of today's talk. So my name's Will Harlow. I've got physio practice in Farnham called HT Physio, and we also have quite a big online audience. I've got a YouTube channel by the same name, HT Physio, which has over 500,000 subscribers, and we get something like 5 to 8 million views every single month. So that's gone from strength to strength. Also a published author. I've got a book, Thriving Beyond 50, which I published in 2020, so I was a busy boy that year. And that's been really popular as well. It's sold over 20,000 copies since publication. And as Katie said, we've got some here in case you like what you hear in the talk tonight. So what we're going to talk about today is, the topic of the talk is secrets to injury-free gardening, how to prevent the most common gardening injuries. And before we dive in, I just want a quick show of hands. Who here has injured themselves in the garden? See 2 hands at the back from Katie. I'll raise my hand as well. Great, so that's most hands going up. So the garden is a really common place to hurt yourself, unfortunately. And it's also a lovely place to spend your time. So if we can minimise the injuries, we can hopefully maximise the time you spend in your garden this year. So we're going to talk about 4 things today. The first thing we're going to talk about is 5 signs that you can look for that might indicate you could be at higher risk of a gardening injury. We're going to talk about some of the most common gardening injuries, what causes them, what sort of precludes them, and how to fix them. Then we're going to talk about 2 of the main triggers for gardening injuries. And then we're going to talk about some of my best strategies for injury prevention that you can use in the spring this year and beyond. Does that sound okay? Good. So, first thing we're going to talk about, 5 signs that you might currently be at a higher risk of a gardening injury this year. So I want you to listen to these signs and see if you can spot any of these in yourself. So the first sign that you might currently be at high risk of injury is you're unable to stand on one leg for longer than 10 seconds. And being able to stand on one leg for more than 10 seconds indicates that you have at least reasonable balance. And balance is such an important attribute when it comes to physical health. And in fact, having reasonable balance has been shown to be a predictor of not just a healthier life, but also a longer life. And There was some recent research that came out just a couple of months ago which showed that people who can't stand on their leg for longer than 10 seconds are actually at a much higher risk of injury over the next 12 months than someone who is able to stand on their leg for longer than that. Partly because of the fact that you're at a higher risk of falls. And we're going to talk more about falls later on in this talk. So the second sign you might currently be at high risk of injury is you've noticed a weakness in your grip. So grip is an interesting thing. It's something I look at in my practice, in my patients. And grip is obviously important in the garden because you have to carry things and you have to lift things. But grip is actually a really good proxy measure for your overall body strength. And there's a really strong correlation between a strong grip and strong legs, and strong arms, and strong shoulders, and a strong back. So if you've got a strong grip, chances are you're also globally strong, which is really, really important for preventing injuries. And one of the first signs that people find when they're losing muscle as we age, which we all do unfortunately, is they can't grip things like they used to. They might have trouble with jars, they might not be able to pick things up off the floor and hold on to them for as long, they might not be able to carry those watering cans for as long as they once could. And that's a sign that you might be losing strength elsewhere in the body as well. There's also a very interesting study that came out recently that showed that grip strength is actually one of the leading indicators of longevity. So if you have good grip strength, that's directly correlated with living longer. Okay, so it's not a cause and effect, it's just that people with a stronger grip do tend to have stronger muscles, and that is a cause of a longer life. So the third sign you might be at a higher risk of suffering an injury this year is that you know deep in your heart that if you were to get down on that floor, you wouldn't be able to get back up again. And everyone laughs when I say that because many of us think, okay, yeah, if I was to get down there, I would have trouble getting back up. But the fact is, if you're going to be in your garden this year, at least some of that time you're going to be on your knees probably, maybe down on one knee, maybe crouching. And if you were to just slightly wobble and go down onto one side, if you couldn't get back up again, that could present a pretty serious problem. So if you can't get up from the floor, again, that's an indicator you're not as strong or as mobile as you should be, and thankfully that's usually something we can fix. Now the fourth sign is that you've had pain in one or more joints for longer than 3 months. Now all of us get joint pain, and to a certain extent, a bit of pain in the joints throughout life is quite normal. It doesn't necessarily mean anything is too wrong, but if you've had persistent pain in one joint or more for longer than a period of a few months, that's a sign that something's not quite right. And that could be because there's some arthritis there, it could be because you've got an old injury that hasn't quite healed. But the problem with having pain for longer than 3 months is that you will stop using that joint as it was designed. And when we stop using it as it was designed, we start to lose strength in that area, and that puts us at a higher risk of injury a bit later down the line. The final thing that I would have you pay attention to that might indicate you're at higher risk is if you start to get out of breath on tasks that you know you shouldn't. Things like climbing one flight of stairs, or things like going from one end of the garden to the other. If you feel yourself becoming a bit puffed, that might mean your aerobic fitness is not what it should be. And feeling a bit out of breath can be a sign that your VO2 max is not where it should be. And if that sounds like gobbledygook to you, don't worry, because I'm going to explain what that means. VO2 max is basically a measure of how well you can use the oxygen in your body, how much oxygen you can take in and how well you can use it. And again, VO2 max has been shown to be a great indicator of overall health and length of life and the avoidance of injury as well. So those are the 5 signs. So it might be worth just paying mental attention to those 5 and thinking, maybe 2 of those are not quite right, or I'm not sure if I could get up from the floor. But if you've spotted yourself in any of those, the rest of the talk is going to be about how to address those problems. So don't worry quite yet. So before we go into what to do about the problems, I want to talk about some of the more common gardening injuries we see in the clinic, what causes them, and how to fix them. So these aren't in any particular order, but the first one is by far the most common, and that is back pain. So who here has suffered back pain from the garden, either from doing too much or from lifting something too heavy or from straining. That's almost every hand going up there, which shows you just how common it is. And I'm not surprised to see so many hands, because with back pain, at least 80% of people will have an episode of back pain at some point in their life. So you're certainly not alone. Most causes of back pain are what we call mechanical, which means that if we were to scan your back, we wouldn't necessarily see an explicit injury in there, but you still have the pain. And what that means is that there's stress on your back, enough to cause pain, but not enough to cause an injury, which is why back pain can sometimes be quite confusing. It's not always down to a strain or a sprain or a disc problem or arthritis. Sometimes it can just be there because the forces on the spine aren't quite right. So what I like to think about mechanical back pain as is a result of imbalances. And it might be that you've got an imbalance between two muscles. So one of them is working too hard and another one is not working hard enough. One of them is very tight and the other one is very weak. And if they're exerting certain pressures on your back that they weren't designed to, the body starts to complain in the only way that it knows how, and that's by producing pain. So back pain is super common in the garden. And some of the big causes of that are weakness in your core muscles, which are the muscles around your tummy, and weakness in your glutes, which are these muscles here, just below the belt line, and also tightness in the muscles around your legs and your hips. So many of the muscles in your legs and your hips, they attach onto the pelvis. If they become tight, they start to pull the pelvis into a funny position, and then the back starts to suffer. And usually the pelvis can take it because it's strong and it's pretty solid, but the lower back, where it's so intricate, it starts to complain after a time. So having tightness in your muscles around here is not a good thing, and we're going to address that a bit later. Now, the second most common gardening injury that we see is similar to back pain, and that is sciatica. Has anyone in here suffered from sciatica in the past? So you guys kind of know what this is, and sciatica basically is just a fancy word for nerve pain in the leg. Now, classic sciatica is nerve pain that goes all the way down the back of the leg, right down into the calf, and sometimes into the toes. Sometimes there can be pins and needles and numbness as well. But when I refer to sciatica, I refer to it more loosely as nerve pain in any part of the leg. So you can have nerve pain down the side, you can have nerve pain down the front. We tend to treat it in a similar way. It's usually caused by a problem in your back. So even though the pain is in your leg, the problem is usually in the lower back. And that's because the nerves start in the spinal cord, then they split off from the lower back and they go all the way down the leg. Now, just as an aside, if you had pain in your arm, that's usually caused by a nerve problem in your neck, which is the same sort of thing. So the nerves start here and they go down here, and in your leg, the nerves start here and they go down here. Now, if you've had sciatica, one of the biggest causes of that is a problem with one of the discs in your back. And you might have heard the term a slip disc or a herniated disc. That's a super common injury. We see it all the time. It's particularly common in gardeners because of lifting and shifting, and it's a particularly nasty injury. It can cause significant disability and pain. Thankfully, it's something we can usually treat quite effectively at my practice, and it's one of my special interest areas. Now, one of the other more common injuries in the garden, or categories of injuries, are sprains and strains. So a sprain with a P is a torn ligament, and a strain with a T is a torn muscle. That's how we refer to them in physio world. And a sprain or a strain always involves a tear to the structure we're talking about, but there's a spectrum of how bad that can be, and we tend to grade that grades 1 to 3. So a grade 1 is basically a small tear, so just enough to give you some soreness for a few days to a week or so. A grade 2, if you sprained your ankle on a grade 2, that would be quite sore. You'd need ice on it. You might nip down the hospital for an x-ray just to check nothing's broken. You might be on crutches for a week or so, and it could take you a couple of months to get better. But then a grade 3 is the most severe. That's when you've totally ruptured the ligament or the muscle, and that's going to take a very long time to get better and sometimes requires surgery. So it can range from just being a little niggle to something quite serious. Now, if you suffer a ligament tear, which might happen because you've slipped or you've twisted something like that, that's usually a sign that the muscles around that joint weren't strong enough to protect you in the first place. So even though we think about strains and sprains as being, just part of life and something you can't avoid, actually people who are stronger tend to suffer with less of these injuries because they're better able to control their joints so they don't get as many slips and trips and twists. So we're going to talk about strengthening. I'm going to give you some ideas for strengthening your muscles to protect from these injuries in the future as well. Now, another thing that's really common in the garden is a flare-up of arthritis or doing something that aggravates an existing arthritic joint. So many people we see, they have arthritic knees, and if they spend too long kneeling or they spend too much time squatting, getting up and down, picking things up from the garden or weeding, the next day they might get a swollen knee, they can barely bend it, and it takes them a long time for it to settle down. And this, you got the stick there, sorry to hear about that. And that is not because they've caused an injury per se, but because they've flared up some existing arthritis. Now, arthritis is an interesting thing because pretty much everyone is going to have some arthritis after the age of 40. So if you scanned everybody's body over the age of 40, 99% of those people are going to have arthritis somewhere, but not everyone gets symptoms from it. And I'm often asked, well, why do some people get it and some people don't? And the truth is we don't know. We know that there are some things that can make pain more likely. Again, things like not being strong enough around that joint or having muscles that are too tight. That can make the pain more likely. But it just seems that some people are lucky and others are unlucky. So regardless of that, arthritis is a fact of life. So almost everyone has it. And we can do things to control these flare-ups and to hopefully prevent them from happening as well. For most people, arthritis isn't constant. It can be a flare-up or a calm down or a flare-up and a calm down. So it tends to fluctuate. So if we can maximize those times where it's really settled and minimize those times where it's really bad, we're going to have a much happier time in the garden. The fifth type of injury, the common one we see, are injuries from falls. So obviously if you fall, you can sprain or strain something, but you can also break something, which is not very pleasant. Has anyone fractured something in the last 12 months? Any broken bones? Or is everyone pretty good? A couple of hands. It's really common to break something, and sometimes it doesn't take that much trauma to do so. Especially as we get a bit older, we start to lose the density of our bones. We can develop things like osteoporosis, and then that means that even a slight fall, something that doesn't look too bad, can lead to a fracture. And a fracture can be really debilitating. So preventing the falls in the first place is vital. It's something I work really hard with my patients to do to improve their balance and stop them from falling in the first place. And then the final category of injury I've got here, and this is possibly the most common, least serious, but maybe most annoying, is repetitive strain injury. Has anyone had one of those where they've done a bit too much and then things have started to get sore and it's taken ages to settle it down? I can raise my hand as well. So a repetitive strain injury, or an RSI, as it's known in physio world, is a catch-all term for tendon problems or synovitis, which is inflammation of the soft tissue in your joints. And they're really common in the wrists, in the hands, in the elbows, in the shoulders, in the hips, all over the body, really. So has anyone heard of carpal tunnel syndrome? Yeah, so that's an RSI. Has anyone heard of tennis elbow? That's an RSI. Golfer's elbow as well. I've had a bit of that in the garden before. Achilles tendonitis, pain back here. We classify all of these as RSI, and these are really common in the garden, especially for people who use tools. And gardening involves lots of repetitive movements, so it's one of those high-risk things. So those are the nasties, those are the dangers in the garden. And in order to prevent them, I think it's important to understand that there are a couple of types of trigger for these injuries to occur. So what I've tried to do here is categorize the triggers into two buckets. We're going to talk about each bucket in turn. So the first type of trigger that can lead to these injuries is the environmental trigger. So that is something that happens outside of you, okay? So something that's happening in the garden. So one of the really common ones is to be gardening in uneven or on slippy terrain, okay? And to suffer a slip or a fall. So especially of all the rain we've had recently, I don't know about you, but I've got some patches of mud in my garden, and The other day we let our cat out to roam, and when it's time for him to come back in, sometimes he says, well, I'm not ready to come back in. I've got to go to work, so the only option is for me to chase him to try and catch him. And a couple of times I've been on the lawn and I've skidded because there's been mud there, and thankfully I haven't yet fallen, but every time I think, gosh, that was quite close. And that's just an example of me not being aware of the environmental factors around me. So be sure to check the ground before you trust it. Things like roots, I don't know if anyone's got like exposed roots in their garden, but those are really common for trips. You can sometimes get your foot caught. My dad was out the other day in his garden and he caught his foot on a root and he fell and he actually fractured his wrist. He's a healthy 60-year-old man, but it was enough to cause a pretty significant injury for him. So checking the environment around you before you start whatever you're doing is really, really important. It sounds so simple, but we just don't do it. And taking that 5 seconds to just have a look around and being like, I've left a spade there. I don't want to get up, walk with a full bucket and trip. Exactly. It's the classic, isn't it? Stepping on the rake and it coming up. Yeah, we don't want that either. So the second environmental factor is the things you have to lift. So being in the garden, obviously we're dealing with heavy things, maybe heavy tools, but I don't know about you, but if you've tried a little bit of amateur landscaping, you have to move bags of soil around and heavy bags of greenery as well. And sometimes it's easy for us to bend forward, pick something up like this, not think, and suddenly you've done something to your back. And if you're like many of our patients, it can take quite a long time of suffering before you seek out help, and it can be months and months of lost gardening time just because you didn't think before you tried to lift something off the floor. Now, we're all guilty of it, so this isn't to say you must have a look at what you're lifting, blah, blah, blah. It's just to make you think next time you're in the garden, is this something I should be lifting on my own, or should I have a little bit of help to come and help me? Now, it might not necessarily be someone else coming to help you. You might be able to use a tool to help you. So wheelbarrows are pretty useful rather than having to lug stuff around. This isn't really a gardening story, but I was thinking about an example where I've done this at home, one of the rare times that a physio has followed his own advice. And we were putting down shale in our back garden. We had a metric ton of it delivered to the front of the house. We don't have a back gate, so it has to come through the house. And I had 25 kilo bags, 50 odd bags or whatever it was to bring through the house. And being a man, I thought there's no way I'm going 50 times. I'm going to take 2 bags at once. And took one lot of 2 bags through. Felt like I was going to cripple myself, put them on the floor and thought there has to be a better way than this. So because we have laminate floor all the way throughout the house, we put down a couple of towels, we put 2 bags on that, and we pulled the towels through instead. So it's just a way to use a little tool to help you to do your job without stressing the body too much. Exactly, yeah. Using levers, obviously things that you can use to help you lift more weight with less effort are also going to really help. So another environmental factor is the task in your garden needing repetitive movements. So I don't know if any of you are cutting up wood in your garden or chopping wood or using the secateurs or trimming back bits of greenery, but quite a lot of these things involve over and over repetitive movements which are the same and obviously are wearing down your strength over time. Now, there's nothing wrong with repetitive movements. They're needed. You have to do them to garden successfully. But the key here is to understand your own risk factors. So my risk factors are going to be different to your risk factors because you might have past injuries in certain areas of the body that have made you more vulnerable to a task than me and vice versa. So my risk factors would be anything to do with my shoulders. I've had a couple of shoulder injuries playing sport, and I know that if I do lots of overhead tasks, the next day my shoulders are killing me. And that's probably not going to get better with age. So I need to be very careful about the overhead stuff that I do. So that's my personal risk factor. You might have a past back injury, so you know that doing lots of lifting and shifting can make you feel pretty bad the next day. So then it's just about mitigating how much of that you do all in one go, maybe spreading it out throughout the day, coming back to 2 sessions rather than doing it all in one go, or spreading it out over the course of a week. Another thing I've put here to mention to you is not to ignore aches and pains. Now we know aches and pains are a fact of life, we do have them, but sometimes that ache or that pain is trying to tell you something. It's trying to tell you that maybe this joint isn't moving as it was designed, or maybe I'm not quite strong enough in this muscle, or maybe my technique isn't as good as I think it is. So just bear that in mind next time you feel an ache or a pain. It comes back a couple of times. It might be trying to tell you something, and it could be the canary in the coal mine before something goes wrong. Now, the next environmental factor that can trigger an injury is using inappropriate tools. So many of us are guilty of having ancient tools in our shed. Maybe our grandparents passed them down to us and we've kept them and we're loath to let them go. But if you're using poorly sharpened tools, secateurs that are blunt, then you are going to be putting yourself at risk of definitely a repetitive strain injury and even cutting yourself or something like that. Now, when I worked in a kitchen, when I was in college to sort of pay my way through mum's rent, I was told that the most dangerous tool in this kitchen is that blunt knife, because you're much more likely to slip and cut yourself on the blunt knife as opposed to a sharp one, which just goes straight through whatever you're cutting. And the same's true in the garden. So if you've got a blunt saw or a blunt pair of secateurs, it is probably time to upgrade it to something that can do the job better. The other thing to think about are worn out grips. So if you've got grips on your tools that have got splinters or they've worn down, you might want to replace those as well. Anything really that's quite rusty that shouldn't be probably needs replacing, because that will really help you to avoid silly injuries that you'll curse yourself if you don't. So those are the environmental factors. That's about what's going on around you. But let's talk about the personal factors. So these are risk factors that are within yourself and things that you can hopefully do something about. So the first personal factor that can lead to a gardening injury is lack of warming up. And you might be thinking, well, I'm not going to go on the treadmill or cycle for 15 minutes before I go out in my garden. That's just silly. And I'm not suggesting you do that. Definitely not. That would be quite silly. But a warm-up basically just means practicing the movement before you go right into the task. Okay? It's just getting your body prepared for what you're about to do. And a warm-up has been shown to reduce the risk of injury in pretty much any activity. It doesn't have to be 15, 20 minutes long. It could be as simple as doing a couple of stretches just before you use those secateurs to prevent an RSI in your hand. So if you're lifting or digging, it's a good idea to practice a few unloaded movements, so some twists or some bends, before you do it with a spade with a load of soil on it, and surprise your back, and that's when it starts to lock up. Okay? The key here is the warm-up needs to be specific to what you're about to do. So if I'm about to do some digging, there's no point me doing a load of hand exercises as if I'm about to do some pruning, because that's not really going to help. And vice versa, if I'm about to do some pruning, I don't need to do a load of back stretches because my back's probably not under much stress. So make it appropriate and specific to what you're about to do. 5 minutes is enough. You don't need to do lots. 2 to 5 minutes is plenty if you're about to go out in the garden, and should really protect you from a lot of the common injuries. Okay? I'm going to talk more about some of the specifics you can do a little bit later on. The second personal factor that can help you to prevent an injury is to improve your posture and your body mechanics. So I want to do a little example here. So let's say that I'm about to do some pruning on a branch that's high up above my shoulder. Now, if you look at me in this posture and I lift my arm, that's as high as I can lift my arm. Can you see how high I can get it? It's not that high. But if I change my posture, I haven't changed the angle of my shoulder, but I can get my arm a lot higher, a lot more comfortably. And I wouldn't actually need to put my shoulder right at the end of range. I could have it down like this. So a change in your posture around your neck and your shoulders can influence how well your arms work. Okay, so it's really important that when we're thinking about posture, we think about what's happening here if we're about to use our arms, because that's going to dictate how well we can use them. Now, the other thing that we need to cover here is body mechanics, which is how well we lift and how well we move. And obviously there's a right way to lift and there's a wrong way to lift. So we're going to talk about how to use the proper ways to lift. And basically, when we're trying to lift something from the floor, all I want you to think about is maximizing how much you put through your legs and minimizing how much you put through your lower back. That's a really good rule of thumb to help you lift more safely. People usually injure their backs because they try and lift from the floor using just their back. Okay, they're not using their legs at all. And we've got some really nice strong muscles in our legs which are designed to help us out. But the truth is, most of us are quite lazy. We just bend down like this, we pick something up. We get used to doing it like that because it feels easy. But then when we've got something a little bit heavier, suddenly that becomes a problem because the back's not designed to do all that work. So if you're not comfortable squatting down a little bit, I would recommend doing some practice of that in your spare time. And we're going to talk about how to do that in a bit. Now, the other personal factor that can lead to an injury is overexertion, okay? And we're all guilty of trying to do a little bit extra just to get it done, aren't we? I think if you see a big task in the garden, it feels a little bit demotivating to say, oh, I'll stop it there and I'll come back tomorrow. Many of us would say, look, we've still got some daylight, let's just get it done. Especially us guys. I mean, we're much worse at this than you ladies. But it's undoubtedly a cause or a contributor to injuries. When we feel tired, when our body is nagging at us, it's telling us to stop and we don't listen to it, that's when we're at a much higher risk of injury. So things like splitting your gardening up into 2 lots of 30 minutes rather than 1 hour, it sounds so simple, but it can be the difference between suffering an injury and not. Not with this weather. I only have a small garden, so an hour is enough, yeah. And then another personal factor which can lead to a risk of injury is poor balance. So as we said before, if you can't stand on one leg for 10 seconds, you are at a higher risk of falls, there's no doubt about it. And we have to adjust our balance very often in the garden. So there's many times where you're not necessarily standing on one leg, but reaching out like this to grab something, that's using your balance because you're off balance like this. Reaching up means your eyes are away from the floor, which again is going to challenge your balance. Sometimes we have to reach into awkward places to do things in the garden as well. So anytime you have to do that, your balance is being challenged. And if it's not great, that is going to put you at risk. And then finally, the final personal factor that can lead to a higher risk of injury is poor strength. So this, for me, is the most important one. And this is the one I focus on the most with my patients, is getting them strong. And we used to think back in the 70s and 80s that being strong was just for guys who like to go to the gym, bodybuilders, but it's not. It's important for everyone. And there's more and more data coming out nowadays to show that strength is an indicator of health, that you can't extrapolate the two, they're directly connected. So improving your strength, thankfully, is possible at any age. And just because you haven't necessarily improved the size of your muscles doesn't mean you haven't improved your strength. So training to get bigger muscles is actually quite different to training to get stronger. Okay, so we're going to talk in a minute about how to improve all of those things. Is everyone still with me so far? Is it all making sense? I hope it's useful and going to help you in the spring this year. So that was kind of setting the scene, but now we're actually going to give you some practical tips. These are, from now on, this is all about how to improve those things we've just spoken about. So this part is called 6 strategies for injury prevention. So I'm going to give you 6 things you can do, or 6 categories of things you can do to help you avoid those injuries. So the first thing, we're going to go back to talking about a warm-up. Okay, and I mentioned the warm-up earlier, and we said it needs to be specific to the tasks. And the goal of the warm-up really is to prepare your muscles, your joints, and your cardiovascular system for some physical exertion, what you're just about to do. You want to improve your blood flow, improve your flexibility, and it will reduce the risk of straining or pulling something. So we're going to talk about a few specific exercises. So I've got some exercises prepped for you. So the first thing we're going to talk about is using secateurs or tools. And we know this is common for RSI in the elbow and in the wrist and the hand, carpal tunnel or tennis elbow, really, really common. And we can prevent many of those just by stretching some of the key muscles in the forearm before we start. So next time, before you start using your secateurs, I want you to try 2 stretches. The first one is this. So you're going to have your arm out in front of you, your wrist is going to come down like this, and the other one is going to come over the top. You're going to pull it down and slightly turn it inwards. Okay? It doesn't have to be to the point where it hurts, just to the point where you feel a bit of a pull coming up the top of the forearm. 30-second hold is enough to get this a bit more flexible, and then you can flip over to the other side. And this time we're going to put your hand back and pull back like this. And this time we're stretching the inside of the wrist. And this is the perfect exercise for helping people with carpal tunnel syndrome. I use this a lot for people with carpal tunnel, and also for preventing golfer's elbow, which is pain here. Tennis elbow, if you're wondering, is pain on the other side. And that one's really good for preventing tennis elbow. So those are two really good stretches for anything you're using with your hands. If you're about to do lots of squatting down and picking things up from the floor, it might be wise to do a couple of unweighted squats just to get yourself working. So coming up and down like this. And a proper squat involves both the hips and the knees. Some people do it like this, which is not correct because you get stuck here. We want to also put the hips into action as well. Okay, can you see how that's a lot easier for me? It's a more natural movement. So you stick your bottom out and bend the knees as well. If you've got bad knees, you don't have to go down too far. You can just go 6 inches down. And if you do 15 of these in a row, you will feel a bit of a working ache here. And that's enough to get the muscles working and to protect them and to get you a little bit stronger when you actually start to use them for your gardening. Now the next thing is, if you're digging, what that often involves is down like this with the spade and then up and there, or up and there. Now if you look at these two actions, they both involve rotation of the spine. We're getting some help from our hips as well, which is good, but we need to make sure our spine is ready to rotate. And in fact, most of the spinal injuries we see in the garden happen from a lift and a twist at the same time, or a bend and a twist. That's a really vulnerable position sometimes for the back, especially if it's not warmed up. So to prevent that from happening, it can be something as simple as practicing a few back rotations before you pick up that spade. It can be as simple as just a few of these, turning from left to right. If you know you're going to be turning in one direction, you can pay special attention to that direction before you start. And it's just doing that for 30 seconds. You'll be amazed at how much of a difference that makes to the risk of injury in your lower back before you start. Now, if you're someone who gets a stiff, achy lower back when you've been digging, it's quite nice sometimes to just take your back through a full range of motion before you start. And I like this exercise, which you can do from a chair. You start off with your legs apart like this, and you just take yourself down through your legs, just as far as you feel you can go. A couple of deep breaths at the bottom, just until you feel a stretch in your lower back. And that can often be enough just to kind of stretch you out and get you a bit more flexible before you start. Now, if you're someone like me who has some issues with your shoulders, when I'm about to use the gym, or I'm about to do something more strenuous in the garden, I might take my shoulder through a full range of motion. So I'll take it as high as I can and back down. Remember, these don't have to be too strenuous as movements, just enough to get the joint ready for what you're about to do. So taking your shoulder through a range of motion is also a great thing to do. So those are some of the stretching and strengthening exercises you can do to warm yourself up. Let's talk a little bit about lifting and carrying techniques as well. So this is the second strategy for injury prevention, and that's to get your lifting techniques correct. So the first thing to say here is to make sure your weight is distributed evenly. Sounds obvious, but many of us go to pick something up when we're over on one side, or we don't think, we twist and we lift. And as I said, that's a big risk. So if we can face things head on, we can have our weight distributed 50-50 between left and right, and then use that proper lifting technique, you're at a very small chance of injury as opposed to doing it without thinking like this. Okay, so it's much more vulnerable to do it in that way. Now, setting yourself before you attempt to lift is another big thing. So I've put on here engaging the core and the glutes, which is a really, really important strategy. So your glutes are these muscles, and your core are these muscles that wrap around the middle. And what I like to do if I'm about to pick something heavy up is I like to have a little squeeze of the buttocks as if I'm trying to grab a pencil between my cheeks, pull in my tummy, and then I'll start the movement. And it sounds silly. You might be thinking, well, why would you do that before you do the movement? But it's almost like it switches something on in the muscles. It connects your brain to the areas you're supposed to be using. And rather than just doing it without thinking, where everything's switched off, I'm taking a conscious effort to put the muscles on and then going. And I feel so much safer doing that, especially if I'm picking up something really heavy from the floor. So try that next time and see if it makes a difference. Now, using the proper body mechanics, as I said before, we want to keep quite a straight back. So to keep a straight back and to still bend, we have to bend at the hips. So there's a difference between doing this and doing this. Can you see that? So if you watch my back, my lower back, and if I bend like this, you can see that I'm rounding it. So I'm elongating the spine, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if I'm now picking something heavy up, I'm relying just on my back muscles to do the lifting. If you contrast that to this, so I keep a straight back, now I'm bending at my hips. Even if I'm not bending my knees, it's my hips that now are helping me back up. And your hips are a lot stronger than your lower back. They're about twice the size in terms of the muscle mass you've got there. Now you can make that even better by bringing the knees into the equation as well. So you keep your back straight, you bend from the hips, then the knees as well, keeping the back straight and then lifting like that. That's the gold standard really to do it. But the key thing here as well is if it's too heavy, don't try and do it on your own. Get some help, get someone in to give you a hand or use a tool, as we said before. Now the other thing you can do if you're, again like me, got a shoulder problem, reaching up like this sometimes without thinking, especially if you're doing it repetitively. I was using a lopper the other day. You can sometimes get some shoulder pain if you don't set your shoulders properly. So just like we set our lower back and our hips before we bend, you can set your shoulders in the right position before you use your arm. And the way we do that is we try and bring our shoulder blade, so this thing here, back and down before we lift. Now that looks like such a silly tweak compared to just going like that, but the difference in control between that and that is massive. So setting the shoulder blades in, pulling them in and engaging these muscles around here before you use your arm is a really good way of preventing shoulder injuries. It's something I teach a lot of my patients how to do as well. So those are the proper body mechanics. We spoke a little bit about the next tip for injury prevention, which is ergonomic gardening practices. And we spoke about using the right tools, so making sure that they're sharpened, making sure you've got a good grip on your tools. But the other thing you can do is to make sure you're choosing tools that are built for ergonomic gardening. So you can now buy tools that are adjustable, so you can make them longer or shorter. You can buy tools that fit different hand sizes as well. And I mean, you just need to go on Amazon nowadays and there's such a range of different things. You can find almost any tool for the job you want in the garden. So don't think you have to use something old-fashioned necessarily to do a job it wasn't really designed to do if there's another option out there. It's also key to note that you might need something different to your partner. So if you've got a certain pair of secateurs or a strimmer, that might not be the right thing for your partner. So don't worry if you need to get two sets of things to protect you both. Now we've spoken about tools already, but let's talk a bit about something else. So ergonomic garden layouts, which is an interesting concept. And that's how you set your garden up to make it as safe for you as possible. So we want to design our garden in a way that limits the stress and strain on the body if we can. So some ideas I've got for you here are to have more raised beds, so things that you don't have to necessarily get down to the floor to do. Nowadays there's something called a vertical gardening solution. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but it's where we have pots stacked up in this direction rather than all along a windowsill or something. One thing I used in the garden, which I didn't use it for necessarily my back, but I found it useful for checking if I was ever going to get any vegetables, was to tie the plants in certain positions so they weren't flopping over to one side. It also made the garden look better, but it makes it more ergonomic as well if they're tied into the right position. Basically anything that minimises unnecessary bending and reaching if you can. The other thing to do in the garden is to try and build pathways if you can, so clear places for you to walk. As I said, if I'm chasing my cat around the garden and I'm on the lawn, it's not really built for me to be on it, especially if we've had loads of rain, so I'm more likely to slip. Now, a year or two ago, I think it was about 18 months ago, we built a snaky gravel path into our lawn. And at first I wasn't that keen on the idea, but it's made a huge difference in the winter because it means I can get from one end of the garden to the other without feeling like I'm going to slip. So thinking about things like that, you can make them very attractive. They don't necessarily have to be ugly, but they'll also really help to minimize that risk of slips and trips as well. So that's how to design the garden a bit better. I feel like I'm sort of preaching to the choir a little bit about that one. The next thing we're going to talk about is definitely more in my wheelhouse, and that's building strength and flexibility. So strength training is absolutely vital, especially for people who like their garden. If you don't work on strength, then you're probably not as strong as you should be. It's really important for improving your mobility. It's really important for injury prevention, and it will just help you have an easier time in the garden as well. You won't feel that the tasks are as challenging as they might be. So if I had to pick a couple of areas to work on strength for gardeners, it would be the grip, super important, just because we need to use our hands all the time. It would be the core, so the muscles in the tummy. It would be the back. We want a nice strong back. It would also be the hips and the legs as well. So working on these areas is key. And I've got a couple of exercises to show you to build strength. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to demonstrate some of these. Perhaps you can use them at home, and don't worry, you don't need a gym for these. You can actually use kit from the garden. So the first exercise is a really simple one. You probably do it all the time anyway, but it's just about doing it with a bit more conscious effort. And this is called the farmer's carry. Okay, it is an exercise. I haven't just made it up. You might call it the gardener's carry because it's something we do all the time. And it's basically holding two heavy implements. So you might have two water cans and walking up and down, maybe from one end of your garden to the other. Now you might be thinking, well, that just seems silly, it's just walking. But if you're holding something heavy, what you're having to do to avoid being pulled down is to use your back. So you're going to get a stronger back. To push yourself forward, you have to use your hips. So you're going to get stronger hips. To keep your legs straight, to stop them from buckling, you have to use your legs, your quads, so you're going to get stronger quads. And guess what? Your hands are going to get a really good workout as well because you're holding something quite heavy. So that's actually one of the best all-round exercises. I see people doing this in the gym. There's no reason why you can't do it in your garden as well. It'd be a really good way to build strength all over the body. Another exercise I like is called the goblet squat. And for this exercise, you just need something with a little bit of weight. You could use your watering can as long as you can hold it with two hands. And you want to hold it into your chest like this with a nice wide stance here. And all we're going to do now is push the hips out, squat down, keeping a nice straight back, only as far as comfortable, and then back up again. So we've got the weight slightly in front of us. So again, what this is doing is it's strengthening your hips to drive you back up. It's strengthening your knee muscles to try and make your legs straight again. Again, we're getting a little bit of work on our grip as well. And to stop us from toppling forward at this position, our core and our back also has to be engaged as well. So again, it's another perfect all-round exercise. I'm showing you these exercises above all others because you get so much bang for your buck. So you can just pick one of these, do it for 5 minutes, a couple of times a week, and it's going to make a massive difference. You don't have to do these every day. The amount you have to do them is actually minimal to make a difference. The next thing is the lunge, and the lunge is a nice strengthening exercise because not only does it make you stronger, but it also improves your balance. So the lunge looks something like this. You step forward and then back like this, and then you can alternate to the other side. You can also do a backwards lunge as well, and you can see that if I wobble a little bit, it's because it's challenging my balance. Again, you don't have to go really deep into it, so if you've got bad knees, you can just do a mini lunge. But you can see that by taking one leg in front of the other, my hips are having to work to stop me from dropping to one side. And because I'm not fully balanced when I'm doing it, my balance is challenged, which means it's going to get better as well. And then the final one I've got for you, which hopefully will be helpful, is the single-armed row. This is a great exercise, again, to use a watering can with. You'll want something to lean on, so I'm going to use this table. You'll set yourself up like this, so you have one hand supporting you, the other hand's holding the watering can, and you're just going to pull it up like this. Now, it's a simple exercise, but again, it works your grip, and it also works all of the muscles around your shoulders and your back. You can see how it's quite relevant for digging, it's quite relevant for chopping wood and sawing as well. Another really good all-round exercise. So if you pick just one of those, incorporate that into your gardening routine just a couple of times a week is a huge, an easy way to get stronger, and it will have benefits all over the body as well. Now, one important note on the strength routines is they should be progressive. So you should make them harder over time as you get stronger. If you find this exercise difficult to begin with and you can only do 5 repetitions, but then next week you can do 6, you should try and do 6. And then the next week you should try and do 7. If you just keep doing 5 every week, you'll get to a point and then you won't get any better. You'll plateau. Okay, so you've got to make it progressive over time. Now we spoke about a couple of stretches. So we had the stretch in the chair where you're bending forward. That's a really nice one for improving your flexibility. We spoke about the rotations. That, again, I classify that as a stretch. You can also do that lying on your back with your leg coming over the top. We can do the forearm stretches too to improve flexibility. That's another great way to injury-proof the body. And we can also stretch the muscles in the chest as well by having our hands behind our head and just opening wide just to get a stretch across the body. So improving flexibility and strength kind of go hand in hand. It's worth doing all of these things to injury-proof yourself this year. Now the next thing I want to speak to you about is improving your balance. So we did speak about the fact that standing on one leg, if you can't do it for longer than 10 seconds, that's not a great thing. But the good news is balance can be improved, again, at any age of life. And balance is a huge thing I work on with many of my clients. And some of them, when they come to see me, they can barely stand up without holding on to something. So you can start from any level. Sometimes you can work on balance from a chair, just by getting people to move outside of where they feel comfortable. As long as they don't topple, if they feel like it's a bit of a challenge, it's going to improve their balance. But most of you people in here are pretty mobile, so you're going to need something just a little bit more challenging than that. And what I would do is I would start off with this 3-stage program. So the first thing to try and do is try and stand with a very narrow base of support, 2 feet on the ground like this. So call this the close stand. And if this is very easy for you, you can try it with your eyes shut. And it becomes a little bit more challenging because 50% of our balance comes from what we can see. Okay, so you might have noticed that if you're trying to balance, if you focus on one point, you get better. If you shut your eyes off completely, suddenly you're all over the place. Okay, so that's the same mechanism at work. Now, if that was very easy for you, you can take it a step further and go to the tightrope stand. We've got one in front of the other. Again, we're trying to balance. And if you find that easy, again, eyes closed, give that a go and see how long you can do it. You can see that is more of a challenge. Make sure you do both sides if you're going to practice that at home. And then the final one is to go single leg stand. And again, if you can, eyes closed, which is definitely the most challenging of that 3-part series. So what I'd recommend you do is find somewhere that's safe for you to do this. So make sure you're doing it next to a kitchen worktop, have your hands hovering. If you lose your balance, you can grab it. The best place actually to do it is in the corner of 2 walls with your back to that. So if you wobble to one side, you're just going to put your shoulder into the wall and nothing else. So anyone can practice balance. And again, you don't need much practice to improve it. A couple of minutes a day over about 6 weeks has been shown to be enough to improve balance significantly and reduce risk of falls. Now, I sometimes tell my patients, because it can be a little bit boring to work on balance, to do it while you're already standing. So brushing your teeth is a good time to do it. You're already on your feet. If you're waiting for the kettle to boil, just wait there on one foot, see how you get on. And over time, that's going to really make a big difference. So it doesn't have to be onerous. I'm not one of these physios that likes people to be doing 2 hours a day of exercises. 5 minutes for me is enough. And just building it into things you already do is the easiest way to do it. And then the final thing I've got for you in terms of reducing the injury risk for you this year is to listen to your body. Okay, so your body may warn you before something goes wrong, and we have to be aware that that's the case and listen for those little warning signs. So if your body is showing you signs of fatigue, if you feel that you've gardened for a couple of days in a row and you don't feel well rested, ask yourself, is today a good day for me to do even more gardening, or should I have 24 hours off and then go back to it? Okay. Now, if you're finding that you've got discomfort somewhere in your body and each time you go back out, it's just getting just a little bit worse, again, that's a sign that something isn't quite right. Maybe you need a rest. Maybe someone needs to have a quick look at it and just check that nothing's gone wrong. Or if you're getting pain during what you're doing as well, that could be not necessarily a sign you're doing too much, but that something's not quite moving as it should do. So look for the aches, look for the pains, look for not recovering between your sessions, and also look for worsening mobility at a joint. So if you feel that on day 1 you can squat down and pick things up easily, but on day 2 your knees are really struggling to get down there and it's a strain, again that could be a sign that things are not recovering as they should do. Maybe you should have a little bit longer in between your sessions. Now, to mitigate this risk, take regular breaks throughout the day. If you're doing 4 hours of gardening all in one go, you might want to just have a tea break every, what's reasonable, 90 minutes? Yeah. 10 minutes. 10 minutes. 10 minutes with a biscuit. Yeah. So just regular breaks. Changing your positions frequently is also important. So if you're down on one knee doing something, make sure you do change over to the other side. These things all sound obvious when I say them, but in reality, they're things we don't always think to do. So just having them in mind is really, really important. And alternating between tasks as well. So if you do want to be out in the garden for 4 hours in a row, that's fine, but don't do 4 hours of strimming. Do half an hour and then go and do half an hour of potting, then come back to it. Now, you're going to get the same amount of work done, but your body's going to thank you the next day. So the final thing I was going to say is a couple of tips. If you do want to have your prolonged gardening session, stay hydrated. Make sure you're drinking plenty of water, especially as it gets hotter. I think we're set for another really warm summer probably this year, by all accounts. So that's a good thing, but we need to make sure we stay hydrated. Wear the kind of protective gear that might stop you from suffering an unnecessary injury and use the right tools. Take those rest breaks if you need them and try and vary the tasks when you're out on a long session. So that's all I have for you today.
It's been a super evening. We've all learned something and hopefully our aches and pains will get less. Thank you very much, Will.
Thanks so much.